I've noticed people talking about an imposter syndrome conspiracy in the last couple of years. I'm Tara Halliday, imposter syndrome specialist, and in this video, I'm going to explore this conspiracy. Is it real? We'll look at the facts and hunt for the truth. Is there a genuine conspiracy or not? First, we need to define imposter syndrome. It is the secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not a fraud, feeling like you're not quite good enough even though you are. And with it, the fear of being found out. The consequence of having imposter syndrome is that you feel isolated, distracted, confused, and you feel like you don't belong. It creates an awful lot of stress and can lead to people quitting their careers. So it's a big deal, and it affects more than 70% of high achievers. Now, a key question is, what causes imposter syndrome? If someone's feeling inadequate when they're not, there must be something making them feel that way. Or maybe it's someone. Maybe there is a conspiracy here. So we'll need to go a little bit deeper into imposter syndrome just so you understand what the experience is. There are 3 symptoms that people with imposter syndrome experience. The first is imposter syndrome thinking that you're not quite good enough, criticizing yourself, judging yourself, doubting yourself, and feeling like you don't belong in this team or at this level. This creates a lot of stress and tension internally. This imposter thinking triggers your nervous system. You have a natural nervous system response to this level of discomfort or perceived threat. Your body gets flipped into the fight or flight or freeze state, ready to defend yourself or protect yourself from whatever that threat is. It creates anxiety, it creates overwhelm, it leads to poor sleep and tension. It's huge amounts of stress. And when we're under a lot of stress, the natural thing to do is try to cope with that stress somehow. So to cope with the stress of imposter syndrome, people start doing imposter behaviors. These include procrastination, perfectionism, comparing, deflecting praise, over-preparing, hiding their opinions and not speaking up enough, avoiding opportunities, and then gritting your teeth and trying to push through and hope it'll all go away. These behaviors take a lot of time and energy, they're distracting, and they're not helpful when you're just trying to do the best you can in your career. So then people judge themselves for doing these behaviors and they blame themselves. And that feeds into the imposter syndrome thinking that, well, maybe I'm not quite good enough after all. Maybe I don't belong here. So the cycle of these symptoms goes around and around, feeding on itself. These are the symptoms that everybody sees in themselves. But what you don't see is the root cause of imposter syndrome. What drives all of this? So let's come back to the conspiracy. If something is making them feel like they're an imposter, what is it? Or who is someone that might be causing it? Take a look at a graduation speech by a wonderful woman called Reshma Saujani. And she's presenting her answer to this question. Now she says, we have her here.
A deliberate tool, a strategy wielded by powerful men to put women back in their place. Imposter syndrome, it's a distraction. It's a strategy. It's a way to keep our concentration on our own alleged inadequacies.
She also says it's a scheme, a strategy, a label to convince women of their own inadequacy, to distract them from the injustices of their environment. Now, another word for scheme is a conspiracy. So let's look at this conspiracy laid out here and how Reshma reaches her conclusion. Firstly, the thinking goes like this. Since women get imposter syndrome, what is the difference between men and women in the workplace? And Reshma concludes,
imposter syndrome is the result of structural inequality.
By structural inequality, she means the gender pay gap, the glass ceiling, lack of childcare, and biases against race, gender, and marginalization of all kinds. Let's check this with the facts and logic and see whether structural inequality does cause imposter syndrome. If we look at the gender pay gap by country, the USA has an 18% pay gap, which means that on average, American women earn 18% less than men do for doing an identical job. And that's been about the same for the last 20 years. Now in the UK, the current gender pay gap is 9%. In Belgium, it's 3%. And in Luxembourg, it's minus 3%. That is, in Luxembourg, the women earned 3% more than men for doing the same job. If imposter syndrome was caused by things like this gender pay gap, then we would see a difference in the numbers of women with imposter syndrome. Belgium and Luxembourg would be saying, hey, we've hardly got any imposter syndrome here. But that's not what we see. Aww. We see imposter syndrome affects 70% of high achievers right the way across the world in all cultures. Any structural inequality in the workplace is not the cause of imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome doesn't go away when we improve the gender pay gap. Here's another data point. My work is only about imposter syndrome, and I've personally interviewed over 700 executives one-to-one about their imposter syndrome. Even people in the most positive, equal, unbiased, and supportive workplace still experience imposter syndrome. So we can conclude that imposter syndrome is not being caused by the external environment. Now, it can be aggravated by a toxic work environment because that's added stress. As we saw, the physiological stress is one part of the imposter syndrome cycle of symptoms. But stress can also be added by all sorts of life events: having a baby, the death of a family member, getting married, getting divorced, moving house, and so on. No one is immune from stress. So yes, we do need to do whatever we can to improve everyone's lives and definitely address any toxic work environments. But doing so won't stop imposter syndrome because that's not the cause of it. Coming back to the conspiracy, it's not driven by structural inequality. But wait, there's another assumption in this conspiracy that we need to address, and that is only women get imposter syndrome. Did you catch that earlier? Here's a quick bit of history. Imposter syndrome was first identified back in 1978, and the first study was done on female graduate students. And when they expanded their study to include men, they found that women reported experiencing imposter syndrome more than men. And for the next 15 years, studies seemed to show the same thing, that it was more women than men. Then in 1997, Dr. Sharon Fried-Buchhalter published a study where the survey used was absolutely confidential, completely anonymous. Then the results showed that women and men experience imposter syndrome at equal levels. She said there was no significant gender differences for imposter syndrome. So why were these previous studies showing that it was more women than men? The previous studies were less confidential, and they captured pretty much a global society trend in that men are not allowed or not willing to reveal what they perceive to be a weakness. It's an underreporting caused by this cultural norm. But when the reporting is completely anonymous, men and women are exactly the same. Here's another data point to support that. In my work, which is exclusively imposter syndrome for executives, my client numbers are 2/3 men and 1/3 women. Now, this is actually the distribution of men and women at the executive level. And the only way I could have that balance in my clients is if men and women were experiencing it equally. So imposter syndrome is not about women at all. It's not a women's issue. It's a human issue. Back to the original claim of a conspiracy that imposter syndrome is a deliberate tool wielded by powerful men to put women back in their place. Well, it just doesn't hold because it's not relevant for men, and men get it too. And indeed, the gender pay gap issue wouldn't affect men either. It means that there is no conspiracy. Now, this video is not a personal attack on Reshma Saujani. I've linked her speech in the notes below. You can take a look at it. It's excellent. Unfortunately, she's drawn the conclusions based on poor information. It's the classic garbage in, garbage out. Not just the conspiracy, but the idea that imposter syndrome is a women's issue, which now you know it isn't. Even today, I'm still seeing new articles saying imposter syndrome affects women more than men, and expect to see this even more in the future when AI-generated articles will be regurgitating this false information, so watch out for it. Now, we still have the question of what does cause imposter syndrome. If you want to know that, check out my recent video on the truth of imposter syndrome and what you can do about it, because I go into the root cause there. And please like and subscribe here if you want to hear more about imposter syndrome. I'll see you soon.